I'm pretty fortunate. In roughly 7 years that I've been running, I only had one injury that actually kept me from running for a while. I've had a couple little minor things, and I think what's helped me is learning some things over the course of these 7 years that have helped me prevent getting injuries. And I want to share some of those with you today. Welcome to Ageless Runner. I'm Ralph. I enjoy running, I enjoy learning about running, and I especially enjoy sharing what I learn about running. And so I'm so happy you're here today. Thank you for being here. So over the years, as I said, I've had one serious injury I'll talk about in a little bit, but I've been pretty much injury-free. A couple little nagging things, again, I'll touch on those. But some things I learned, some tips I'd like to share with you. And one of the first big thing is to know your threshold. By that I mean, if you exceed too many miles a week, at some point in time, you're going to be more prone to injury. Your body's going to be tired. You're going to overuse your joints. We know our joints don't work as well as we get older. We lose synovial fluid. That's a lubrication that's in our joints. We know our muscles and tendons become weaker with time. And so we're more prone to injuries as we get older. And therefore, that threshold, if we don't pay attention, are we getting injured or not getting injured, and we go over that threshold, we're just going to always have these nagging injuries. I think I'm below my threshold. I have no idea what my threshold is, and I can't tell you what yours is either. I think I'm below mine because I've been running relatively injury-free for a lot of years now, and I'm probably in the 20 mile or less per week at the moment. And I think that works for me. So if you're suffering a lot of regular injuries, you may be over your threshold. You may want to consider backing off on your miles per week. So just be aware that there's some threshold out there that if you exceed that, you're going to start being injured more often. So tip number 2 is to listen to your body. If you're feeling a little nagging discomfort, a little nagging pain, you need to be aware of that and maybe take some few days off, give your body some rest. And maybe that's also a sign to back off on your mileage. Maybe take a week where you reduce your mileage, give your body a chance to heal and recover. If you're in the mode in your running life where you're increasing miles, be aware that the general rule of thumb is don't increase more than 10% a week. And again, that's a very general rule of thumb. Maybe if you're very early in your running life, you maybe go a little higher. But if you're already doing a lot of miles on a run, maybe that's too much. So be careful how quickly you increase your miles. But listen to your body. Don't let those little nagging aches and pains get ahead of you. My next tip deals with strength training. I'm not talking about doing overall strength training. That's important for a lot of reasons, but when it comes to running injuries, it's more of be aware, do you have weak areas of your body? Maybe you want to focus on strengthening those areas. I have 2 examples. One is I used to have a little bit of patellar tendonitis. The patellar tendon is that tendon that goes right in front of your knee, and runners can get achiness there, it gets inflamed. And I would actually wear a brace or support for a while. It never stopped me from running, but just a general nagging issue. Well, I started going to the gym and started doing leg extensions, and lo and behold, after a while, the pain was gone. So I think strengthening my legs, doing that exercise helped that issue. But that was what exercise that worked for me. I do suffer a little bit with my IT band on my right side, and I actually at one point in time went and got physical therapy, and they said it was my weak glutes, so they gave me exercises to do my glutes, which is another suggestion that if you are suffering nagging pain, go seek out support, professional help, see a physical therapist. They may give you the right exercises or stretches or whatever to help with that nagging injury. So think about your weak areas. If you have a weak area, consider exercising and strength training in those areas to help minimize the risk of injury. And my next tip deals with our stride. Sometimes if our stride's too long, forces of impact when our foot strikes the ground, sending all those forces up our leg, too long of stride can make that worse. So consider shortening up your stride a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot. I'm thinking like 10%, just a little bit. Shortening up that stride will give you a little quicker turnover, get a little more soft landing with your foot, and reduce some of those impact forces on your leg. So try shortening your stride up a little bit. You may need to practice that. Maybe you need to, it may feel a little uncomfortable. Maybe just take a short run and for half a mile or so, try shortening up your stride till it seems more natural for you. But doing that could reduce the impact on your feet and your legs. Now, my next tip is don't do aggressive running too often. I call aggressive running anything where you're running fast, maybe doing an interval or you're just doing fartleks, whatever. Don't do those too often. Or hill work, doing hill repeats. Again, that aggressive running is more harder on your body. It's more wear and tear, makes you more prone to injury, especially if you're not warmed up. If you're going to do those speed work or do those hill repeats, make sure you're well warmed up before you do those things. But don't do them too often. Again, you have to be the judge of what is too often, but the more you do them, the more you risk opening yourself to injury. So let's broach the subject of stretching. It's a little bit controversial. There's not a lot of research. Well, the research actually is contradictory. In other words, some research says doing, for example, static stretches before a run can help. Some research says stretching before a run doesn't help. So it's more of an individual thing. The one thing I would recommend is avoid static stretching before you run. By static stretching, it's where you pull a muscle and stretch it and hold it for a little bit, trying to see how far you can push it. Don't do that before a run. I'll give you an example right now of how I think that caused me to have the one serious injury I had. And this was maybe I was a year or 18 months into my running life. I went to go do a trail run. It was cold that day. And when I got to trail run, I decided to stretch my calves because it was calf stretches that helped me deal with an issue of plantar fasciitis I'd had. And so I pull my car into the trailhead there and get out and stretch my calves. And when you stretch your calves, you also stretch the plantar fascia muscle in your foot. So I did that, did my stretches, took off running. About halfway through my run, my foot landed, I think, on like a tree root. And when the heel came down, instant pain in my foot. I tore my plantar fascia muscle, and that took me out for several months. And today I still blame it on doing that static stretch before the run in the cold. I was not warmed up. I did that in the cold weather, and I think that led to my injury. So be very careful doing static stretches before you run. What you do want to do before you run is dynamic stretching, where you like a squat or leg swings or high steps. Those kinds of things are very good to do before you run, but they're not static. If you want to do static stretches, it's better to do them after you run when your body's all warmed up, your joints are well lubricated. So be very careful of doing static stretches before you run. Now, the most important piece of equipment you have as a runner are your shoes. So if you want to avoid injury, make sure you have good running shoes that fit you. If you're not sure how they fit you or if they're really the right shoes for you, go to a running store. They have people there that can watch you run, they can watch you walk. They can understand how you run and the types of running you're doing. I recommend a pair of shoes that would work best for you. That's running is not a real expensive hobby, but you do need to spend decent money on a good pair of shoes that fit and work best for you. That's the number one thing. I don't know if it's the number one thing, but it's a really key thing in minimizing injuries. Have a good pair of shoes with the right amount of cushion for you and fit you well. Now, in the unfortunate event that you do get injured, you need to, obviously do something. You hear the acronym RICE, R-I-C-E, rest, ice, compression, elevation. I would start there, see if you start to make progress. Again, do not be reluctant to seek out professional help. I wish I'd done that when I tore my plantar fascia muscle. I was in transition with my life at the time, retiring and moving, and just didn't do it. But do not be afraid to seek out professional help to take care of that injury. But at least follow the RICE acronym, rest, ice, compression, and elevation, and give yourself enough time to get over that injury before you start running back again. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you never have an injury that keeps you from running. If you follow some of these tips, that'll go a long ways to keeping you a healthy and safe runner. So thanks again and happy running.